Hello, listeners. Today we bring you a special episode. Our Rethinking Humanitarianism host, Heba Ali, was in Brussels last week for the European Humanitarian Forum, where she moderated a panel on principled humanitarian action in Ukraine. Here is that conversation.
Hello, everyone, and welcome to this conversation about principled humanitarian action in Ukraine. My name is Heba Ali. I'm the CEO of The New Humanitarian, and I will be your moderator. The New Humanitarian is an independent, nonprofit news organization that reports about humanitarian crises around the world. So be sure to sign up for our free daily and weekly news digests to keep up with the latest news about Ukraine and beyond. Okay, so today's discussion is extremely relevant, not only because the invasion of Ukraine has had such major geopolitical consequences, but it is also shaping humanitarianism in many ways, and not all of them for the good. As my colleague Jessica Alexander wrote in The New Humanitarian, mega crises have the potential to trigger sector-wide humanitarian reform, and Ukraine is today's mega crisis. The crisis in Ukraine has been defined by a challenge to the very notion of humanitarian neutrality, as we saw in the massive backlash and misinformation campaign against the ICRC after its president met with the Russian government. It has been defined by a conflation of military and humanitarian aid, and I've heard members of the Ukrainian parliament directly tell me the best humanitarian aid for their country is weapons. It has been defined by different standards being applied for Ukrainian refugees fleeing to Europe than other refugees. It has been defined by much higher levels of funding for Ukraine than other humanitarian crises, not because of higher levels of need, but because of its geopolitical relevance. And finally, it's been defined by donors to the humanitarian response all being aligned with one party to the conflict. David Harlan of the Center for Humanitarian Dialogue was speaking to me over breakfast this morning, and this may be a bit controversial, but he said, it's like the new tribalism. It's like going to a raid with teenagers, getting them excited by screaming, Russia bad, Russia bad. And I don't mean to minimize things. Obviously, this is an extremely devastating and terrible, terrible conflict. But the sacrosanct humanitarian principles of neutrality, impartiality, and responding based on need alone are being directly challenged in this crisis. So we're going to be looking at whether it's possible to provide principled humanitarian action in such a highly polarized conflict, and whether you can be politically not neutral while being neutral in the humanitarian response. But before we get into the discussion, we're going to hear a few thoughts from the woman who coordinated humanitarian aid to Ukraine at the national level in the early days of the war, Ukraine's Deputy Prime Minister for European and Euro-Atlantic Integration, Olha Stefanishina. And I got it right before, and I got it wrong this time. Stefanishina. Thanks. Please, go ahead. Yes, Stephanie.
Thank you so much. Indeed, probably it would be much easier to discuss the best way to better coordinate and address humanitarian needs if we all will call what is happening in Ukraine a war. It is a full-scale war which has been lasting for 9 years and which has started in its most atrocious and unbelievable way on 24th of February. Now, it's very important to build the proper energy over the discussion today and understanding what could be the best way to address the needs of people in the areas affected by the war is to recollect what was happening on 24th of February. First and foremost, we managed to preserve full operation capacity of the government at all levels, from local level to central, including parliament and the government, which means that all the registers, all the databases, all the financial payments has been released in a timely manner to all the people who needed that. The financial and banking sector has remained fully operational as well. So despite the full-scale war, massive attacks and bombing, and occupation of around 50% of the territory of Ukraine, we still remained fully capable to deliver on the needs of Ukrainian people. Of course, the first things we did is the organization of the humanitarian staff, which allowed to coordinate and ensure the disbursement of all the humanitarian needs to Ukrainian people throughout the area of Ukraine, including the areas which were occupied. We outreached to absolutely each and every individual partner, whether it's international organization or it's a partnering relations on a bilateral level for something that we need to survive. Whether we needed a facilitation of dialogue on the green corridors to release Ukrainian people from the occupation, whether it was support to those people who were escaping the war through the territory of European Union, whether it was addressing the food, financial needs, and economic and social and psychological needs of the people. And now, a year after the full-scale aggression, it is extremely clear for all of us which of the instruments worked and which of them did not. Because by the end of the day, the major element of the assessment of the effectiveness of the humanitarian response is the individual support provided to Ukrainian people, to the people who faced enormous, atrocious consequences of war. So what do we have now? First hours of the war, the EU civil protection mechanism has been enabled, which allowed us to mobilize and coordinate at the level of the EU member states all the necessary assistance, whether it's the camps, the heating, the food needs. It was extremely important to have a partner which able to coordinate efforts among many stakeholders. And financial support released through civil protection mechanism was essential. All the UN institutions were mobilized as well. We needed a lot more political engagement to make sure that we're not only able to address the needs of Ukrainian people suffering from the war, but we are also wanted to make sure that we can ensure this needs for as many people as we can, which required arrangement on the green corridors and the release and escape of people from the occupied areas. As you all have seen the pictures from Bucha and Borodyanka and Izium in Kharkiv, you know very well that for months people have been under occupation, blackmailed and pushed and forced to surrender through lack of electricity, water supplies, connection, through massive physical tortures and assault and sexual violence. So making sure people could be released from the occupation was essential. And it was equally important that making sure that people who are coming back from the occupation are able to get all the necessary services. So it is extremely important that a part of coordinating humanitarian assistance, mobilizing it through civil protection mechanism and other instruments individually or within UN system, we could also make sure that as a government we provide necessary services to people. So we established the survivor centers throughout the area of Ukraine where people could get all the necessary information, supported services, but also get legal and psychological assistance in case they've been subjected to sexual or any other kind of violence. A part of addressing purely humane issues as a consequences of this war, knowing that Ukrainians are not going to surrender, knowing that Ukrainians will fight even without a military support that we will need it. Russia has made another attempt to start another wave of demoralization of Ukrainian people. The massive attacks to the critical infrastructure targeting to deprive all Ukrainian people across all the territory of Ukraine from water, electricity, connection, or anything which we were calling or supposed to call a normal life. None of these scenarios has been successful. Together, we have survived. We managed to identify the key needs to ensure the stability of the Ukrainian critical infrastructure systems, and we were supported by our partners, and we managed to survive the winter all together, all European countries, all countries across the globe, but also Ukraine. And I'm particularly proud to be here in the end of the first month of spring, coming from Kiev, which is full of light, access to water, and fully connected to the whole world. This has been done together by all of us, and I want to thank you all for that. A part of these challenges we have been facing and addressing together. It's also important to think on two major things. First and foremost, it is absolutely clear to us that Ukraine is winning the war. Ukraine will win on the battlefield. This is the only way out of restoration of the security and stability across Europe and across the world. But I fully share the message of my president saying that the major support humanitarian address is more military, because for us it's really important to understand that basically the moment we are able to end the war on a battlefield, this would be the moment where we will be able to end the suffering of Ukrainian people, including those who have been forcefully deported to the Russian Federation without any minimum information about their conditions and about their access to the basic need we're talking about. So this is the message which is very, very important. The other very important element is the consequences of this dirty war and the blunt atrocities brought by Russian war to the territory of Ukraine. After the end of the war, Ukraine will remain as one of the most, if not the most, mined territory around the globe and around Europe. The mining would be lasting for years and years, if not a decade, after the end of this war, as a reminder of this blood and unprovoked aggression on the territory of Ukraine. This is the challenge which should be addressed systematically together, and I address all of you today to unite our efforts and to stand with us in these efforts, again, to protect and to save life of Ukrainian people. We have also faced the unprecedented migration of Ukrainian people from the territory of Ukraine across the European capitals to the other countries. I think that it was of admiring how Ukrainian people were hosted in many countries. They are still remaining now. And I'm really grateful to everybody who stood with us in making sure that Ukrainian people would feel at least safe and warm, accepted, being deprived of their homes and their lives they've been having before. So, speaking of the priorities for the next period of time, again, referring back to the fact that it is extremely white and black to see what instruments are working and which instruments are not working. Because by the end of the day, when we're talking about the humanitarian response, it's important whether Ukrainian people, every Ukrainian citizen, every citizen across the globe facing the atrocities of the war or any other conflict can face the support. First is demining, as I've said. Second is the massive support of the population when we're talking about the rehabilitation, psychological and psychiatric care for victims. This is the area which needs to be explored, where we need to build the capacity based on the best practices, and I call on your support to help us with your expertise, knowledge, and instruments at your disposal. We also draw your attention to the necessity to onboard investments related to the reconstruction, which is not purely related to the humanitarian assistance per se, but it's also a very important element of humanitarian response, making sure that we attract investments to a fast recovery, fast reconstruction of Ukraine throughout the ongoing war, which is essential to us. Colleagues and friends, it's important that the voice of Ukraine is heard. And sometimes we might seem a bit more emotional than usually. Sometimes we might seem a bit more radical and blunt. But believe me, back in Kiev, in a country where the war is lasting, everything is really black and white. And I call on you to hear us, to hear our messages, to take timely actions, and to support us to make sure that one day we not only celebrate the victory of Ukraine, but also will celebrate all the lives we managed to save and secure by our assistance. Thank you.
Thank you so much, Deputy Prime Minister. And I'd like to follow up with a question jumping off of what you've said around, this is an unprovoked invasion. There is a clear right and wrong in this conflict. And the recent arrest warrant by the International Criminal Court for Vladimir Putin is likely to reinforce what, as you refer to it, has been a very black and white approach of this conflict. In this kind of context in which many would argue you can't be neutral in the face of evil, do you believe that there is a place for neutral, impartial humanitarian action that would help victims on both sides of the conflict and that is not coordinated with the Ukrainian government because whether it was provoked or not, you are now a party to this conflict?
Well, I could be really aggressive on that, but I won't be.
You can be.
But I won't be aggressive. I'll just give you a very simple example. I see Maxim Dotsenko here. He's been with us on the very first day, helping to evacuate people from Mariupol. And all the UN system has been onboarded to Lviv, including special rep of UN Secretary General. And it took us quite a long time, I would say a couple of weeks. For a country in war, it's an extremely long time to adjust and to start understanding each other. We couldn't understand what's the point of misunderstanding until we got a very simple understanding on both sides. Everything UN has been doing in terms of addressing the consequences of war was not applicable to Ukraine, because Ukraine has remained fully operational as a government, fully operational as at the level, as I've said, of all the institutions, which means that like 80% of everything UN has been enabling as an instruments wasn't extremely like 100% relevant because we had the government which needed to be engaged with. And it's extremely important that the wording used within the UN system is not, in fact, applicable as well, because the war is taking place only within the territory of Ukraine. The war has not raised from a bilateral territorial conflict. The war has not been provoked by any of countries, including, of course, Ukraine, which makes unclear to understand what are the support for both sides of the conflict. We, in fact, support Russian soldiers who are the prisoners of war. And I think this is the best life they ever had, being a prisoner of war in Ukraine. And this is the support we can talk. They've been given access to by all international monitors and etc. But speaking about the support for both sides is something which is incomprehensible by us. In fact, I think that we should rather concentrate on access of international organizations to those Ukrainians who has been forcefully deported to the territory of the Russian Federation, the families which has been forcefully splitted through the filtration camps. None of us has the access to the data. We cannot assess, even speaking about Mariupol, how many people died there and how many people have been forcefully displaced there. Nobody has the information. Nobody has the access to these people. And I cannot imagine what could be done to bring these people back when we are not even able to identify all of them. So I think that there are some issues which are more important.
So am I hearing you right that you are saying you don't see the role for external humanitarian agencies in Ukraine because there's only one side that's suffering and you as the government are perfectly capable of responding to those needs? I'm going to turn to the rest of our panel and Filippo Grandi, UN High Commissioner for Refugees, ask you how you react to that view. I think there's problems with the microphone. If you can just turn it maybe a little bit closer and up. There we go. C'est bon là? No, the translator still can't hear.
Can you hear me now?
There we go.
It has to be very close. Okay. I would say that when it comes to humanitarian work inside Ukraine, yeah, I also don't have a problem. I would say, first of all, the minister knows we've been discussing this matter many times. I think it's true, at the beginning it was unusual for everybody. This was not a usual situation. And I think the UN and other agencies had to adjust to a rather effective government in leading the humanitarian response. And the government had to adjust to the way of working of the United Nations. It took a little while, I agree, but I think it's actually gone very well. I would not get to the point to say that international humanitarian assistance is not needed. I think it's still needed. Your president said this to me in front of you just a few weeks ago. It is still needed, but what I think is important to stress is, one, I agree the government is very effective in coordination, more than in most other places where we work, and it is able to set the priorities, and we discuss, but we agree. And second, there is an incredible resilience in civil society. I spent a week in Ukraine in January, traveling everywhere. We alone, UNHCR alone, we work with 200 groups. These are civil society groups. You know, there's so much talk about localization in the humanitarian domain. Well, that's it. We are working mostly through a localized model. And I think that this is very, very important, and the strength that also humanitarian assistance serves the people that it is supposed to serve. I think this civil society component, together with the government, is important to stress. Now, I also agree that where there is a big gap is access to the areas occupied by the Russian Federation. That's a big issue. And that's one that is not easy to resolve. How do we access there? There are political issues that exist, you know, if you access from one side, from the other side, you know, and I think that humanitarians, whilst saying we should access, also need to appreciate the complexity of the situation. The point remains, however, that access is urgent and important, because I think that also the request of the government that we cooperate in tracking, identifying, accessing people that are on the other side of the front line can only happen if we're there. If we're not there, it's difficult for us to have that access. And that brings me to the other point, Heba, if I may, which is that access especially, not especially, because on the Ukrainian side there's no problem. On the side controlled by the Russians, that access can only be obtained through engagement. with the Russian Federation. And that's complicated. That's complicated because of all the politics surrounding it. But there I would make a pitch that organizations like the Red Cross, the International Red Cross, the UN, humanitarian agencies, we need to have that engagement, because without that engagement, we will not be able to provide the information that legitimately the government of Ukraine is requesting about its own citizens. Final point, and then I promise I close, where I think that there are also interesting aspects here to consider. Sorry, I'm mixing a bit things. Ukraine, the war, the Russian invasion and the war in Ukraine has generated the largest displacement that we have seen for decades, if not ever, after the Second World War. Between refugees, displaced people, it's absolutely enormous and continues to be. But there is a characteristic here. In many places, displacement is caused by the government of the country of origin, not here. Here, the displacement is not caused by the Ukrainian government, but by the Russian invasion. So that creates a certain relationship between the government of Ukraine and the displaced people, which is quite unique, quite unique. But we have been working well on that. And here, I would like to join the Deputy Prime Minister in thanking European countries, especially, for having hosted such large numbers of people in a manner that is quite exemplary. This temporary protection status that prevails almost all over Europe is good. But here I want to make a point that has nothing to do with Ukraine. This is a good model for other types of protection to refugees in Europe that is not applied in other situations. So there is a disparity there. This has nothing to do with neutrality. This is another characteristic that needs to be addressed, and we can talk a lot about that.
And I do want to come back to that question because it also speaks to principled humanitarian action at a global scale. And I will come back to that. But I just want to, in one line, ask you then to confirm or deny that the idea that in a polarized conflict like this, international neutral, impartial humanitarian aid is not needed within Ukraine. It's only a question in the occupied territories.
No. Hello?
Close to, hold it very, very close.
It's very close, okay. I didn't say that. I think it is needed also inside Ukraine. But
can the Ukrainian government provide impartial humanitarian aid?
Well, Ukrainian government, let's put it that way, determines what the main needs are. We discuss with the government. Sometimes there have been disagreements, but by and large, I think the cooperation has been good. And I personally think that international aid component is still needed. And of course, if we disagree, it's not because the Ukrainian government is fighting, frankly, an important military action that we will be deterred. If there is something that we do not agree with, we will raise it. I can raise one point, I know, because Deputy Prime Minister was present, I think, in that discussion we had with President Zelensky. For example, on the children, this very debated question. One of the ideas is can we help some of these children return to Ukraine and be hosted in Ukraine? And of course, we will do whatever it takes according to the basic principle, best interest of the child, to work on this if we have the space, especially on the Russian Federation side. But I would like to say what is important also is if the children are in Ukraine, and if these are unaccompanied children, children without families, then the Ukrainian childcare system needs to be improved. That we have said very clearly, and we will continue to say, and I think there is agreement that we work on that.
A discussion for another day, I think, that part. But I do want to pick up on the point around the occupied territories that you've both made and turn to Maxim Dotsenko, the Director General of the Ukrainian Red Cross. The point you've been making on access depends on, as you've just said, engagement with the Russian side. And yet when humanitarian agencies have tried to do that, they have been perceived by the Ukrainian population as not being neutral. So when the president of the International Committee of the Red Cross at the time, Peter Maurer, went to Moscow to shake hands with Sergei Lavrov and discuss access as part of the work that they do to talk to all parties of a conflict, that then kind of triggered a very big backlash, as I mentioned, in Ukraine against the Red Cross movement. How then can organizations that are meant to do that kind of cross-line work gain that engagement in order to gain that access if the concept of neutrality is not well understood?
Thank you very much for this question, and very difficult question, to be honest, and of course, a very difficult question for Ukrainian Red Cross Society, because we have to understand that our staff and volunteers, this is particularly somehow the victims of the war. You know, someone lose their family, someone lose their home, and keeping the status of neutrality, principle of neutrality, for them, this is a very difficult task. But anyway, we as Ukrainian Red Cross, we as a movement, put in a lot of efforts to keep this, to provide this neutral, impartial, and independent support to our people on both sides. Definitely, we are one of the biggest humanitarian actors in Ukraine, local actors, international actors, and we are quite affected by these waves of criticism. And we are talking about access a lot of times. Yes, this is one of the main issues in Ukraine, the access to the population on occupied territories, the access to the population on the territories controlled by Ukraine, and it creates a lot of challenges for us. But at the same time, the complementarity, for example, which movement can provide, we are consistent from the three movement components, ICRC, IFRC, and partner national societies, gives us a privilege to talk really on a different levels. Ukrainian Red Cross Society provide the support on the territory of Ukraine, which under control of Ukraine. ICRC, as mandated by civilian agreement, by Geneva Convention, it's mandated body of movement who have to talk with both sides. And it gives us an opportunity to reach the people who are in need now. And of course, the other question of security of humanitarian workers, the question of security of our staff and volunteers. Unfortunately, as a Ukrainian Red Cross Society, we don't have the access on occupied territories, but with some exemptions, which shows that the reality can be different, context can be different. For example, we were present in Kherson during occupation. Our local branch was very active there, and we support thousands of the people.
And how did you manage to have that access when you couldn't in other areas?
This is the other very complex question in different contexts, you know. For example, we don't have the access to Zaporizhia occupied region, and for Kherson region, which is occupied. But we were able to stay in Kherson, and we were somehow, let's say, perceived by that administration, and they give us the opportunity to work how it have to be according to the humanitarian principled action. It have to be so. We need to have this access, and we need to support our people on the territories. Really, of course, after the referendum, after 30th of September, we put on pause our organization because they pushed to re-register as an organization of Kherson Red Cross or something like this. And it's, of course, cannot be as such, because no one cannot push to change the structure of humanitarian actors like Red Cross. And this is very important for us. So, you know, I agree that the question of access and question of really neutral, independent, impartial support have to be the priority in such conflict, in such international conflict like this. And as I said before, the providing of the security of humanitarian workers, this is the core, because we cannot be there if our staff and volunteers are in danger. But maybe one more thing to add. This is the importance of local actors. Yeah, we're talking a lot about localization. What does mean localization? It's just using the national actors for some field operations, or this is increasing their capacities to be ready to act in future. To be, we really saw that national actors was quite active at the first days of wars. As Madame Vice President Minister said, that we were talking with her from the second day of the war, and we're trying to support our people. This is very important.
So you talked about the challenge of being neutral when your own people are dying and you feel solidarity with that suffering. Marie-Pierre, I wanted to come to you, Marie-Pierre Calais, CEO of ACTED, as an international NGO that doesn't have to face that challenge in particular. Have you had better success in being able to access some of those areas and maintaining that principled humanitarian approach?
Thank you. I guess the question is how an international NGO can contribute to disconnect the humanitarian aid from the different forms of support which are currently made to Ukraine, which are by definition not neutral. I see three main challenges. The first one, it's already been mentioned, which is the access. The second one is how to reach the last kilometer, and more specifically, the most neediest in the last kilometer. And finally, the third one, and it has been also mentioned, is how to engage a partnership with the Ukrainian actors. On the access, the principal humanitarian action requires us to engage all parties and to reach all people in need, regardless of who is controlling the territory. Now, the reality is that the humanitarian community is ready to do that, is prepared to do that, but the Russian Federation do not grant access to a number of territory. As a consequence, to be very clear and very straightforward, we do not have access to a significant part of the people who are in need. The access issue, specifically in human-made disaster, is an issue which we are increasingly facing across the board. In the Ukrainian specific war case, the usual creative humanitarian solution, such as using the link of staff with local community, etc., is extremely complicated and in the vast majority of the case not available to us. The second challenge, how to deliver aid to the last kilometer. The question of accessing the last kilometer near the front line comes with the risk of compromising with the security of the civilian and of the humanitarian personnel. However, in the vast majority of Ukraine, the risk is quite limited. Thus, in this area, the key issue is to identify the most needed at the last kilometer, while the situation is changing, the needs are evolving, and the population, up to some point, is mobile. Finally, for the third challenge, main challenge, I would say, how to engage with the Ukrainian actors. I think let's be clear, the central and the local authorities, government, and the civil society are the first responders. They are, according to me, they are impartial the way they facilitate or the way they deliver aid, and they are equally impartial in the way they are selecting the most needed person. But obviously, they are not neutral on the issue at stake in the conflict. In addition, I would say that while the Ukrainian actors might have a broader definition of humanitarian than we do, the question is how we clearly segregate what is the international humanitarian assistance from the other action they might have or they might be willing to do.
Thank you, Marie-Pierre. And I think from this discussion until now, what we're hearing from the Deputy Prime Minister is that within Ukraine we can take care of our own needs, which is perhaps a provocative perspective, but very interesting in the context of localization to start getting used to that idea in the case of Ukraine and then seeing how that applies when the Somali government says that or when other governments say that. As Marie-Pierre is saying, you can be impartial but not neutral, and that's something we often hear from local actors as well, that don't ask me to be neutral, that doesn't mean I can't provide impartial humanitarian aid. And then this question of complementarity, that where international agencies can really add value is then to focus on the occupied areas and gain access. And for that, there's a need for engagement with Russia. And I will note that like many of these conferences, there is no Russian delegation here to engage with. And so that's maybe something also to think about. And we do have a session this afternoon on humanitarian diplomacy that tries to get at exactly this. I'm going to switch tacks a little bit now and pick up on something that Filippo said earlier about the more global picture, because it also speaks to principled humanitarian action. And that is how the response to Ukraine compares to other responses around the world. So I want you to consider a few statistics. And let me give you the disclaimer that these statistics are a mess to make sense of. And following the money in Ukraine and beyond is something we plan to do more of at the New Humanitarian. So forgive me if anything ends up being not exactly accurate, but we've done our best. According to the UN, Ukrainians represented 7% of people in need around the world in 2022. And funding for Ukraine was 16% of the total funds. So 7% needs, 16% funding. If we take that another way, in 2022, funding given for Ukraine meant that nearly $200 was spent on each person that was targeted for assistance. If you look at that level for Ethiopia, it was nearly half, so $100 per person. And in Ukraine, the requests for assistance have ranged from washing machines to pet food, while people are starving to death in the Horn of Africa. I know these are very stark comparisons, and it's never pretty to kind of rank a hierarchy of need, but I want to set the scene in turning to the Swedish Minister for International Development Cooperation and Foreign Trade, Johan Forssell. In November, you announced a new unprecedented winter aid package for Ukraine, bringing your total contribution since 2022 to some 160 million euros, if I'm not mistaken, which is well over 10% of your entire humanitarian aid allocation. Would you consider that a needs-based approach to your funding?
Thank you for that question, and let me first say that I'm very proud of the very strong support for Ukraine. I think it's easier to talk about only about states here, but also, let's also mention and remember the civil society and organizations and individuals, of course, but also private companies. And needless to say, Ukraine affects Sweden. It is in our neighborhood, but I think it's also important to underline that Ukraine really affects us all. Just look at the food shortages and the energy situation, the rising inflation, etc. From a Swedish perspective, I want to underline that Sweden has for many years and will continue to be a very active donor globally. Later today, we will co-host the Turkey and Syria Donors Conference. Only a couple of weeks ago, we also co-hosted the Yemen Conference. So, and also looking at last year in 2022, the 5 largest humanitarian allocations from a Swedish point of view were Ethiopia, Afghanistan, Yemen, Syria, and the DRC. So what we have done in Ukraine is actually additional funding. And that is sometimes not mentioned in the public discussion and in the debate, but that was the case last year, at least in Sweden. So I would answer your question by saying that to us the problem is not really the needs in Ukraine, because they are enormous, of course, both when it comes to the humanitarian side and also the long-term aspects of not rebuilding Ukraine but building Ukraine up again. I would say that the problem here is the gap, really, between the humanitarian needs and the humanitarian funding.
You say it was additional funding in Ukraine, but as is the case with many other donors, there was a decision to make additional funding available in this case that hasn't been made in every other case. And part of the issue has also been diversion of international aid budgets towards hosting Ukrainian refugees at home, which has also garnered a bit of criticism. But I will let you off the hook for now, Minister, and turn to your colleague on your right, another donor that has given very high levels of humanitarian aid to Ukraine is the European Commission, of course. And we have with us the new Director General of the Commission's humanitarian aid arm, ECHO, Maciej Popopovsky. Maciej, the same applies to the EU as I just asked Sweden in terms of, the Commission spent 24% of its humanitarian funding in 2022 on Ukraine, despite what I said about the level of needs. But I want to ask you a slightly different question, which is, when you have a conflict in which all of the major donors are aligned with one party to the conflict, and the EU is first and foremost among them in terms of that allyship, what impact do you think that has on the neutrality or the perceived neutrality of the humanitarian response? And how do you think a humanitarian response can be neutral in a case like this?
Well, all right.
Now you're too close.
I need to hold it like a rapper. Look, I wouldn't say that we are aligned with one side of the conflict. We are on the right side of history, and it doesn't change anything in our compliance with the principles. We'll still do it, but we are doing the right thing, and this engagement has been very successful. And in this whole gigantic effort, we managed to keep the right balance. So what we did in Ukraine was not done at the expense of other crisis situations or other countries. We used reserves, we did a lot of redeployment and repurposing. I did it also in my previous job, and it has proven very successful. I'm new in this function, so I'm still internalizing the principles and the vocabulary, so I learned about the localization, and I know it has worked in Ukraine. I've always been impressed by the resilience of Ukrainian institutions at all levels. I remember when Olha sent me a WhatsApp message on Easter Sunday telling me that the replies to the famous questionnaire on membership applications just arrived in my mailbox. It was 1 o'clock in the evening. It has worked everywhere, and this element of localization, engagement with the local authorities, it continues throughout. We know that the mayors in Ukraine have become local heroes, and they keep delivering what is needed for people wherever they are, because we follow the people. The other term or principle that I internalized is the nexus, and again, it is very well at play in Ukraine, where the humanitarian support, narrowly defined, is part of a bigger picture. And it's impossible to draw a line between, let's say, early recovery and the reconstruction effort. Most of it will happen when the war is over. But it has to be now, and that's what we've been supporting since the beginning of the war, for instance, by providing support to school rehabilitation. I had an opportunity to see one of those schools together with President von der Leyen in Irpin in September of last year, and there is more to come. We are now talking about phasing out cash assistance and integrating internally displaced people into the Ukrainian social security system, etc., etc. And the last point I want to make, to echo what Olga has said and thank her for that. The delivery by the European Civil Protection Mechanism. Somehow it's underestimated because it's not always very easy to put a figure on it. But this is a real thing. In my first week in office, we managed to send 267 generators from Poland to Ukraine. They are now being distributed wherever they are needed. This is also part of the bigger reconstruction effort.
I want to come back to the reconstruction in a minute, but just a quick question on your point that you can be on the right side of history but still comply with the humanitarian principles. How? How do you strike that balance?
Look, we follow the people in need. And I don't need to expand on the access issue. It has been explained by everybody on the panel. But we certainly stick to the principle of humanity and independence and neutrality. And you're impartial when it comes to suffering. But we are still supporting the Ukrainian government, the Ukrainian authorities at all levels, and the Ukrainian people in the first place.
Okay, so separating the political stance from then the humanitarian funding and the way that it's channeled and delivered. We are running out of time, but I do want to pick up on the point you made about the long-term recovery of Ukraine, and then take an intervention from the audience, a couple questions, and then come back to the panel. The World Bank was meant to be with us today. They had to cancel at the last minute due to a family emergency, but they estimate the cost of Ukraine's reconstruction and recovery to be about 320 billion euros. So I'm going to turn, if I can see him in the audience, to Dr. Daniel Beck. Are you here somewhere? Can we get a microphone over here? The Deputy Head of Division for International Organizations of Germany at the Federal Foreign Office, for a few thoughts on that transition to the long-term development work.
Thank you, moderator, and thank you very much for this very insightful discussion. I just wanted to make 3 quick points, indeed, which has been come up here. First of all, of course, upholding IHL and ensuring humanitarian access is, of course, key for us from a German perspective as well. Second, what has been mentioned by the Deputy Prime Minister on MHPSS and psychosocial support, something which we really have to recall and keep in mind that this is an important issue now in this ongoing terrible conflict. But as you have referred to just now, the third element is the nexus aspect, which Maciej Popowski has just already mentioned. While we still have this focus on humanitarian assistance now, it is important to also already now bring in the development actors and look into resilience matters, which we can and have to start in order to look into rehabilitation and recovery for the country. So this is something which we would really support and would be keen to hear more about. Thank you so much.
So maybe we can just take really quick reactions, either from you, Deputy Prime Minister, or ECHO or Sweden, on the degree to which that longer-term effort is already kicking in. Are you getting the commitments and pledges that you would like in terms of the much bigger reconstruction effort, or are we much more focused today on the immediate humanitarian response?
Well, thank you so much. Once again, I want to bring our attention to the fact that all the assistance we manage now to accumulate is the assistance necessary for our survival as a country, as a nation, right? And when we're talking about the post-war reconstruction, is about giving us the instruments to be able to build back the country, to attract investments, and also consider the whole project of the post-war reconstruction as the major window of opportunities for additional investment and for additional economic growth within Europe. But speaking about the urgent needs and I would say the proportion, Madam, you were referring to in the humanitarian assistance and the assistance to Ukraine comparison to the other countries. Back in 2002, before 21st of February, we were in a totally different situation. Some were very low beyond other African countries in need. And speaking about displacement, for example, in Ethiopia, which is 3.2 million of people, for the last 2 years, we're speaking about the fact that 9.1 million people has been displaced from 21st of February within Ukraine and beyond its borders. So it's very inequivalent to make these comparisons because we're speaking about addressing urgent needs of survival, People who were dying, escaping from the corridors, which, let's say, were the outcomes of the bilateral negotiations of Ukraine, and Maxim has been part of that, including the All Red Cross and UN system. We have been negotiating with Russians on the green corridors. We have been fixing these arrangements. I was signing the letters personally. And I know every letter with every list we've been signing. And we had these arrangements with the Red Cross and UN, but then all of you saw the shelled cars of people who are trying to leave the Bucha with the families and the children being in these cars. So it's what we're talking about, the impartiality and readiness to engagement. We were engagement, we were setting the steps on the arrangements, but by the end of the day, we saw the dead bodies of Ukrainian people. That's very important just to have this angle when we're talking about the impartiality and neutrality. The way we engaged UN and the Red Cross was to supervise this principle exactly. But by the end of the day, when you're sitting in Kiev, in the center of the city, as a member of the government, and knowing that 20,000 of people have already approximately died in Mariupol because you were not able to ensure their release through the green corridor. You can agree on anything, but by the end of the day, you should also make sure that those people who will be given the green light will not be murdered or filtrated through a forceful deportation. That's a very important humanitarian angle, not very much related to answer to your question. But again, when we're talking about addressing the needs in such circumstances, everything which has been done in 2022 was urgent needs for survival. And luckily to the Russian people and the Russian society, they were not at the edge of these needs.
And it'll be interesting to see now when you add the nexus on top of the challenges we've been discussing over the last hour. It's going to add another layer of complexity when we start getting into that longer-term recovery. But yes, Minister.
Thank you. Can I just add very shortly? I think it's a great question, by the way, because we are still only in the beginning of the challenges here. The humanitarian aspects, they're enormous, but still they're still minor compared to the challenges when it comes to building Ukraine back up again. And I think there is a lesson here that goes for Ukraine as well as also from other conflicts around the world, and that is that you can really fight poverty with economic development cooperation, but in order to make a path to prosperity, you also need to add something else, and that is international trade, economic growth. You need to have more investment. You also need to attract more private capital. You need more of that too. And I'm actually sharing two different portfolios in Sweden, both the development cooperation side, but also the portfolio of foreign trade. I believe coming back in a few years from now, I think that will be more of a role model than it is today. There are only a few countries in the European Union that has that same model today. And the aim of that is to find the synergies here. And I think Ukraine is a great example of it. And at least everywhere I go in the world, of course, economic development cooperation is asked for, but also foreign investments, exports, market economy, more private companies, and economic growth. And I think that's a great tool, as I said, because the aim here is not only to fight poverty, the ultimate goal must be to build this path to prosperity.
A very brief comment from Echo, and then if you've got questions in the audience, to put up your hands, and we'll take two before we close. Yes.
Very briefly, the cost of reconstruction, of course, is a moving target. I mean, the figure you mentioned was presented in Lugano, that was in July. That has changed. It's unfortunately changing by the day, but it means we have no time to waste. So we have to do the rebuilding now. We can do it using different tools. Tools don't really matter. I mean, the good example of how it should work, I mean, is the incredible success story of the Ukrainian railways. So they repair everything that needs to be done. And this is a very functioning and high-performing operator. It's impressive. And this notion of building back that Olga mentioned, we also have to bear in mind that in this huge effort of reconstruction, led by the Ukrainian government, supported by the donors, we are going to rebuild the future member of the European Union.
Aha. I think one of the questions, and maybe Maria Piero or Filippo, when we come back for a last round, you can reflect a little bit on, how is that transition from humanitarian to development going to look like, and where does the humanitarian caseload stop, and this kind of longer-term poverty reduction / rebuilding start. But let's take a couple questions from the audience, if there are any. I saw someone with a hand up. So I see two in the front row here.
A question for Deputy Prime Minister Jamila Castro from Cities Alliance. So you mentioned that essential infrastructure has been massively destroyed, hindering access to services, and that the recovery and the reconstruction of the country is a window of opportunity. We know that women and children make up the bulk of the refugees in the crisis. How can the Ukrainian government ensure that women get a seat at the table in those reconstruction and recovery efforts so that their needs and perspectives are taken into account and in this window of opportunity? Thank you.
Great. And then let's take a second question.
Thank you. Hans Lunshoff, independent, but I talk much based on my 28 years with UNHCR and my time in Croatia and Bosnia, which I think is relevant, although it was a very small-scale laboratory compared to what we face today. And agreeing fully with the Deputy Prime Minister, obviously, that Ukraine government and institutions are in the lead, and that we're all very impressed about what we have seen that is being done already under this ongoing onslaught. I've been following international discussions about reparations. There are proposals that you probably know as from the New Lines Institute, to use Russian funds that can be seized, and there will be much funds needed. So also international funds, so that the internationals come to play, although the work has to be done in Ukraine. What I miss in those proposals is mostly the human rights dimension. And as you have said, and it's the same as treating POWs in a fair manner, if you reconquer territories within the territorial integrity of Ukraine first, you will have territories that have been under occupation for shorter or longer periods of time, and all people are Ukrainians, because we don't accept the forced naturalizations of deported people or people that stay there. So I think I would make an appeal that Ukraine continues to have the moral high ground, and that also, when reconstruction is considered, it considers all Ukrainians, and that is really communicated very clearly, irrespective of ethnicity or leaning or whatever, because you have to deal with people that have been very much influenced by the authorities under which they have lived for shorter or longer times. We have seen that in the Balkans. It is still very difficult in many areas.
Very interesting point. And then let's just take one last question. I think there was one over here. Yes.
Dear Excellencies, my name is Volodymyr Kuska. I am a humanitarian worker with ECHO in Ukraine. Thank you very much for all the comments done and the very interesting discussion. Me as a humanitarian worker, I am very curious how the entire humanitarian system will learn from this crisis in Ukraine, from such a large scale. How to ensure the core principles that you mentioned, how to prevent and how to make the humanitarian system agile and flexible for any possible crises around the world. Thank you.
Thank you so much. So, and if you could just put the questions from Slido back up, I'll just take one of those as well. And what I'll do is ask you, Deputy Prime Minister, to answer the first two questions around the inclusion of women in terms of having a seat at the table in the reconstruction effort, and the inclusion of all Ukrainians, regardless of whether they've been under occupation or not, in again, the way forward, including the possibility of reparations. And then I'm actually going to close with your question and put that to all the panelists. So please.
Well, thank you so much. Indeed, I also cover the gender profile in the government and supervise this integration of gender component into all the reconstruction efforts. But first and foremost, for us, it's also really important to learn the lessons we learned throughout this war, where indeed women and children has been among the category of the mostly displaced persons, and basically we have been running the economy of war through women's and elderly people who have been supporting Ukrainian economy, because most of the men had to go on a front line, had to stand with the arms for their country, and we're speaking about small and medium enterprises mostly. So we have now a very feminine and women angle for small and medium development of the small and medium enterprises, and that would definitely be included in all the post-reconstruction efforts. But also we have a special gender agent within the government who is ensuring the integration of this component in all the formal documents. So on the reparations and human angle part, that generally I trace this very thin line among the discussion at this panel and the reflections on your side, that there is some differentiation between different Ukrainians from the areas in Ukraine, which is definitely not something that we feel back in Ukraine. So all Ukrainians are Ukrainians, and especially in those areas which have been deoccupied, the attention to these people is doubled. So we're taking triple efforts to bring back the normal life to these areas, to bring back the banks, the post offices, the services, the administrative services, to ensure first and foremost demining and access to basic needs of the people. So and there's no definitely differentiation between different Ukrainians. But of course, as at any territory, there's been some collaboration with the Russian occupiers who supported torturing of Ukrainian people, who supported atrocious war crimes, and this is something which cannot be tolerated, and this is extremely important for the justice, including the reparations you were referring, but it has nothing to do with any kind of differentiation. And I think I want to thank you for bringing this angle, because it's very important to have the spirit from Ukraine. And when we're talking about the areas like Crimea or Donetsk and Lugansk region, by regaining back these territories, when the moment comes, there will be a specific discussion on those people who has been brought from Russia to Crimea as part of the broader militarization effort. But this is a faraway discussion, and at this stage, every Ukrainian is a Ukrainian, whether he speaks Russian or Ukrainian or Hungarian or Romanian. These are all the country we live in.
Thank you. To close, I'm going to ask the rest of our panelists to answer one question which picks up on the last question that was posed, and some of the ones that I'm seeing also on Slido, which is, we've talked about a lot of the challenges. What is one lesson that we've learned from this crisis, one way forward that you can envision? So as the gentleman put it, how will the humanitarian system learn from this? How will we ensure respect for core principles in the future? So what's one lesson or takeaway? And I'll just add to that this question from Slido, which is pointing to another question of principles being the failure of international organizations to provide overheads, flexibility, and risk sharing to local organizations, that too is a failure of principles. So what can we do differently next time around? Marie-Pierre, maybe I can start with you.
Yes, thank you for this very easy question. But as we're running out of time, I would maybe, on a more personal note, which is conclusive remarks, and in the meantime, trying to respond a bit with your question, I would like to point out the impressive commitment and of the volunteers in Ukraine. The volunteers, with determination and courage, have taken the initiative to support the most needed in their own civil society, in their own society. And I have to admit, and I have to say, that I have never seen in my life of quite a number of years with humanitarian work, such continuous and efficient commitment. And really, this is what I will take away from all this crisis, and I really would like to send my regards to all of them for their extraordinary work and for the extraordinary work the civil society is doing in Ukraine.
I want to take the angle of lessons learned from a slightly different perspective, if I may, and going back to the issue of perceived disparities, right? And I want to just, because I listened carefully to the Deputy Prime Minister's point, she's right. We should not, in making the argument of equity in responses, do it with a view to diminish the needs that are in Ukraine. We all know, all of us have been there. We have seen the enormity. We're talking about the so-called nexus, right? Bringing recovery. And very good. It's a very important thing that we're doing in Ukraine to talk and do and support recovery very early. But let's not forget that we do that as destruction continues to happen in many parts of Ukraine. So the needs are huge. My point here is, I take the argument that there has been additionality. Very good. I don't think it's true for every donor, but certainly some donors have given additional funding for Ukraine without taking away funding for other crises. The reality is that it's not that there is too much for Ukraine. That's what is needed. The reality is that there is too little for the other crisis to begin with. That's the problem that needs to be addressed, I hope, also by this humanitarian forum. There are places in Yemen, in Eastern Congo, in Bangladesh, and the list is very long, where simply we don't have enough resources. And the fact that Ukraine has happened has maybe not taken away, thank God, because it was already very little, but certainly it doesn't allow any addition. And this is the big challenge that we have to face. Likewise, and I said it, I want to repeat it again, the fact that Ukrainian refugees have been treated well in Europe is not something that we want to diminish. They need to be treated well. And I want that to continue. I hope it continues. But that means that it is possible to do the same for other refugees as well. I'm not naive. I know the complexity, but this is the fundamental issue. It's not less for Ukraine and more for others. It's equity, and it's paying attention, and it's learning the lessons, the good lesson of what has been done for Ukraine and Ukrainians, and try to apply them to others as well.
Maxime, one lesson in ensuring effective and principled humanitarian action.
So we're talking a lot about neutrality, impartiality, and other principles, and for me, this is not the question. The humanitarian aid have to be neutral, have to be impartial, and we have to follow these principles. The main lesson learned, which will wait us in the future, this is how to avoid these situations which was mentioned when the green corridors was agreed and then violated. Which tools we will have to push the states to respect the international humanitarian law, to provide the access to neutral, impartial humanitarian aid. When we're talking about auxiliary role of Ukrainian Red Cross Society to the government, for us, it's not the question, it's easy or difficult to be neutral. We are neutral in our humanitarian field of work, and this is the main. And which system we will build in future, how we can avoid this in the future. This is not only lesson learned for Ukraine, this is lesson learned for all the world in the future. Thank you.
Thank you, Heba, for facilitating this very rich discussion, I think. I believe there are several key takeaways. First and foremost, I also admire the bravery of the humanitarian workers on the ground, like the Ukrainian Red Cross Society. It's a tremendous work, really. Secondly, I think it is also important to underline the importance of the standing up for the humanitarian principles, and I think that's also one of the key takeaways, not only from this discussion, but from this forum as a whole. And thirdly, I would once again like to emphasize what the Deputy Prime Minister said about the need for attracting foreign investments for fast recovery. I think that is one of the things that we have not been discussing enough, and I am convinced that this will be one of the most important discussions in the future, not only to addressing the humanitarian sides of things, but also the importance of building Ukraine and other conflicted areas back up again. Thank you.
And final word.
Thank you. Look, I'm sure we've learned one thing so far, how to combine speed with legality and quality of our interventions. Now, in the past, the EU was forced to manage crises using procedures developed to manage agricultural markets. That has changed. The Temporary Protection Directive that you mentioned was drafted, adopted, and enacted in 4 days. And learning process continues also for myself, so I'm going to on my first mission as DG ECHO to Ukraine next week.
Well, thank you all for those thoughts. I take away from that this response has taught us of the importance of equity and that a better response is possible, and let's do that elsewhere. It has reminded us of the need for tools to ensure respect for international humanitarian law, a long-standing challenge and one that was discussed at this forum last year, but remains a challenge. The distinction between neutrality and impartiality, and that maybe there's a space in separating those two that helps us navigate some of the challenges that a crisis like this poses, particularly when there is such a locally led response. I think this has been a real example of localization in action, and maybe an eye-opener for the humanitarian community in what that means in terms of the traditional notions of impartiality. And finally, I think a call for really starting with the recovery even while the destruction is still happening, as someone put it.